"Get down on the ground now," the cop's voice screamed. "Skylar," the black girl blinked. Her heart pounded. What's happening?" One of the cops, Detective Sullivan, stormed forward, grabbing her arm before she could even react. "Do not play dumb. You know exactly what's happening. You were just seen making a drop in the back lot." Skylar's mind spun. Making a drop? What were they talking about? What? Her voice shook as she tried to understand. "I just came in to buy Save It. Hands behind your back." Before she could protest, she was yanked backward. Her wrists snapped into cold metal handcuffs. Panic clawed her throat. "Wait, this is a mistake. I don't know what you're talking about. I just got here." But they were not listening. As we delve into this story, if you strongly stand against injustice and prejudice, tell us where you are watching from and click on the subscribe button now. Only those who support injustice will not subscribe. Days later, the courtroom was silent, but not the kind of silence that brings peace. This was the kind of silence before a storm, the kind that holds injustice in its grip and dares anyone to fight back. At the center of it all, Skylar Monroe, a young black woman barely out of high school, sat handcuffed at the defendant's table. Her wrists were red from the metal biting into her skin. Her back was straight, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. The storm of fear, of shock, of betrayal. Across from her, Detectives Reed and Sullivan sat too comfortably, their smirks barely hidden. The white officers exchanged glances, their confidence oozing from their posture. This was not their first time doing this. It was not even their 100th. They had played this game before, and they had always won. The judge, an older man with a stone-cold expression, leaned back in his chair, barely acknowledging the defense. He was not interested in hearing Skylar's side of the story. His bias was clear, written in the deep furrow of his brow and the dismissive wave of his hand whenever Skylar's lawyer spoke. The prosecutor stood, a polished smile on his lips, turning toward the jury with the ease of a man who already knew the verdict. "The evidence is overwhelming," he declared, motioning toward a black duffel bag filled with drugs that never belonged to Skylar. Skylar's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, wanted to fight, wanted to tell them this was all a setup, but the system was not designed to listen to people like her. She glanced over at her mother sitting in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. Then her eyes shifted to the back of the courtroom. There, a man sat quietly, still as stone. His dark eyes did not move, his face unreadable. His suit was crisp, his posture relaxed. At first glance, he looked like any other spectator, but there was something different about him, something cold, calculating, dangerous. Skylar's father, David Monroe, was watching. He did not flinch, he did not react. He waited. The prosecutor continued, his voice growing stronger, more confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, pacing the room like a man who owned it, "we have not one, but 3 witnesses who saw the defendant in possession of these drugs." He turned to the 2 corrupt cops, nodding. Reed and Sullivan sat up straighter, ready to play their part. Skylar watched in horror as they lied through their teeth. "We observed Miss Monroe attempting to distribute these narcotics in a school parking lot," Detective Reed stated, his voice smooth, practiced, like he had done this 100 times before. The jury nodded. The judge did not blink. The public defender barely objected. Skylar's heart pounded. She wanted to scream, "I wasn't even there," but she knew it would not matter. The jury was already convinced before this trial even started that the cops looked proud of themselves, like they were untouchable, like they could plant evidence, lie under oath, destroy lives, and walk away laughing. And in any other case, they would have. But this time they framed the wrong girl. David Monroe did not move. He did not react. But in his mind, he was already dismantling every single person in that room. Every cop, every lawyer, every corrupt official. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The trial continued, but the real war had already begun. The prosecutor walked toward the jury, smiling. He was already celebrating. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a clear case. The defendant was caught red-handed, and the testimony from 2 respected officers confirms it." "Respected?" Skylar almost laughed. The judge leaned forward, finally speaking, his voice booming through the courtroom. "Miss Monroe," he said, his tone condescending, "do you have anything to say before I hand down my verdict?" Skylar opened her mouth, but her eyes moved to her father again. David Monroe still had not moved, still had not reacted. But this time, she saw it, a ghost of a smirk, a silent promise, a warning to them. They thought they had won. They thought it was over. But this was just the beginning. It was supposed to be a normal evening. Skylar Monroe had just left her college campus, her mind still buzzing with the details of her upcoming midterm exams. She was ahead in all her classes, pulling straight A's, and had already received internship offers from 3 major firms. She had her future mapped out, and nowhere in that plan did it include sitting in the back of a police car with handcuffs biting into her wrists. But that was exactly where she found herself. How did this happen? It started with a single stop at a convenience store. Skylar had no idea that when she pulled into the small gas station on the corner of Ridgewood and Main, she was walking into a trap. The neighborhood wasn't bad, but it wasn't upper class. Either she had stopped there plenty of times before. It was just a place to grab a snack to fill up her gas tank before heading back home. But that night, the moment she stepped inside, something felt off. There were two men in the back of the store, talking in hushed tones. They weren't buying anything, just watching. And then there was the cashier, an older man who looked nervous, like he was waiting for something to happen. Skylar should have trusted her instincts. But she ignored the feeling, shook it off. She grabbed a bottle of water, a bag of chips, and walked up to the counter, and that's when it happened. Before Skylar could even react, she heard the screech of tires. Police cars. Red and blue lights flashed outside the windows. The next thing she knew, the front door slammed open and two officers rushed inside. "Get your hands where we can see them now." The voice was loud, commanding, unnecessary. Skylar froze, confused. The cashier, the two men in the back, none of them moved. The cops weren't looking at them. They were looking at her. Outside, more officers had gathered. People from the neighborhood had come out to watch. Skylar's body trembled as she was dragged toward a police car. The lights blinding, the officers gripping her like she was a dangerous criminal. She spotted a woman filming on her phone, whispering, "This is messed up." Skylar tried to turn toward her, tried to beg for someone to listen. "I didn't do anything, please. I was just inside the store." Detective Reed stepped in front of her, his expression unreadable but his voice filled with arrogance. "Oh yeah? Then why were you spotted making an exchange with a known drug dealer out back?" Skylar felt her stomach drop. "What I wasn't, even we've got two witnesses that saw you. And guess what we just found?" Reed held up a black duffel bag. A bag she had never seen before. A bag filled with bricks of drugs. Skylar stared at it, her mouth dry. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. "That's not mine. I don't even. Where did you get that?" Reed scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh come on, you're really going to stand here and pretend this isn't yours? You were seen coming out of the back lot right before we arrived. You think we don't know what's going on?" Skylar felt like screaming. "I was in the store. Check the cameras. The cashier saw me, the other customers." But when she turned toward the cashier, her last hope, the man looked down and said nothing. Skylar's chest tightened. He was scared, or worse, he was in on it. Her heart raced. This wasn't just a bad misunderstanding. This was planned, set up from the start. "Please check the store footage. It will prove." Sullivan shoved her forward. "Oh, we'd love to check the footage. But see, there's been a little problem. Looks like the cameras were down tonight." "Too bad." Skylar's stomach twisted into knots. They were lying. They had everything covered. And the worst part, number one was going to stop them. Back at home, David Monroe was cleaning his gun. His phone buzzed. A single message from a restricted number. They took her, Ridgewood in Maine. Afterwards, Skylar was granted permission to make a call. She speedily dialed her father. "Dad, I'm being arrested for something I know nothing about. Please help me." David set the gun down slowly. He stared at the message for a long moment, then picked up his keys. If these men thought they could take his daughter and get away with it, they were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. The air in the courtroom was thick with the weight of unspoken truth. This wasn't about justice. It never had been. It was about control. About reminding people like Skylar Monroe that the system wasn't built for them, that no matter how innocent they were, no matter how clean their record, all it took was a lie from the right person to take everything away. She sat there, bound, back straight, her face carefully blanked, even as her heart hammered inside her chest. Had her trapped, but she wouldn't let them see her break. Detectives Reed and Sullivan sat across from her, lounging back in their chairs like kings in their own castle, their expressions smug, their uniforms crisp. They had done this before. They knew how this game was played, and they knew exactly how it would end, because they had made sure of it. Reed glanced at his watch, bored. Sullivan leaned back, arms crossed, his grin just a little too wide, just a little too pleased. Skylar clenched her jaw. She knew why they were so confident. Because the evidence was fake. The drugs they found planted, the witnesses they claimed to have lies, the so-called missing body cam footage that would have cleared her name, a convenient technical error. They had set her up perfectly. And worst of all, the jury, the judge, the prosecutor, they all knew it, but none of them cared. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair and a voice polished from years of practice, stepped forward. His words were like a well-rehearsed script, each one designed to twist the truth into something unrecognizable. "Miss Monroe was found in possession of a large quantity of illegal substances," he said, his voice rich with false sympathy. "Drugs that, based on the testimony of two highly respected officers, were intended for distribution. Now, we all want to believe in second chances. We all want to believe in redemption. But let's not be naive. This isn't about a misunderstanding. This is about keeping our community safe." Safe. Skylar almost laughed at the word. How was she a threat? She was a college freshman, an honor student who had never so much as touched a cigarette in her life. She had spent her entire life doing everything right, making sure she never gave anyone a reason to doubt her. But it hadn't mattered. It never mattered, because when the system decided you were guilty, the truth became irrelevant. Her attorney, a frazzled, overworked public defender, stood up weakly, flipping through his notes. He wasn't bad at his job, but he had no real power here. He knew it. Skylar knew it. Even the jury knew it. Your Honor, her lawyer began, voice shaking. The prosecution has yet to present any concrete forensic evidence linking my client to these charges, the alleged drugs. The judge waved a hand, already disinterested. Move it along, Counselor. Skylar felt her stomach drop. He wasn't even pretending to be fair. Her mother sat a few rows back, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she stayed silent, helpless to do anything but watch. Skylar turned her head slightly, to the back of the room, to the man who had said nothing this entire time. Her father, David Monroe, was still there, unmoved, expressionless. He sat with perfect stillness, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes locked on the front of the room. He hadn't reacted once, hadn't stood up, hadn't argued because he was waiting, watching, planning while the court proceeding dragged on. David Monroe stood up and stepped out. He did not storm out in anger. He did not cause a scene. He did not threaten anyone, because David Monroe was a different kind of man, and men like him, they did not beg for justice. They delivered it. Long before he was a father, David Monroe had been something else entirely, a ghost, a weapon, a man whose name was whispered in terror in underground networks across the world. The CIA hadn't just trained him, they built him into something beyond lethal. He had spent 2 decades hunting the most dangerous criminals on the planet, cartel leaders, warlords, corrupt politicians, arms dealers. He didn't just know how corruption worked. He knew how to dismantle it. He had infiltrated systems that were far more powerful, far more protected, than a bunch of dirty cops playing judge and executioner in a rigged courtroom, and now they had his daughter. They had no idea what they had. Just stunned, David Monroe didn't call lawyers, because lawyers couldn't fix this, no. He called people in high places, people who didn't exist on paper, people who could erase entire police departments if they wanted to. The first call, the Department of Justice. He didn't ask for favors, he gave them a choice. Check your email in 5 minutes. After that, you'll know why you're about to do exactly what I say. Clicked at the second call, Internal Affairs, Reed and Sullivan. Pull their records. You're going to want to take notes. Click the third, call the FBI in this one. This one wasn't just a favor. This was a personal request to an old contact. I need Vanessa, he said quietly. David Monroe knew detectives Reed and Sullivan thought they were untouchable. They had been doing this for years, framing people, destroying lives, fabricating evidence, making sure their records were clean every time. Internal Affairs came sniffing around, but there was one thing they never saw coming. David Monroe knew how to find ghosts, and now, they were the ghosts he was hunting. Vanessa had once been one of the best undercover FBI informants in the country. She had spent years infiltrating corrupt organizations, exposing networks of crime from the inside. Disguised as a journalist, she started asking questions. Why was every drug case in the last 10 years connected to Reed and Sullivan? Why did key evidence go missing whenever they made an arrest? Why did every black suspect they arrested get the harshest possible sentencing? And the biggest question of all, why were they so confident they would never be caught? Then, the first cracks started forming. David Monroe knew exactly who to call next. Not the police, not the media. A hacker, a man who owed him a favor. Need the store footage, the original, not the one they showed in court. The hacker didn't ask questions, because when David Monroe asked for something, you gave it to him. Within 10 minutes, the footage was recovered. The real footage. The footage that showed Skylar never touched the duffel bag. The cops had planted it. There was no drug deal. And then, the hacker found something else. Something much, much bigger. Every single false conviction Reed and Sullivan had orchestrated. Every crime they had pinned on someone else. And worst of all, a hidden recording. One they never thought would see the light of day. Reed's voice, laughing, bragging, in a video saying we could throw a brick of coke at any black kid in the city, and a jury will still take our word over theirs. It's that easy. The evidence was undeniable, and David Monroe had just put the noose around their necks. Back in the courtroom, Skylar wasn't sure when she had started holding her breath, but she exhaled slowly, forcing her pulse to steady. Her father wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, and if he was this calm, then that meant one thing. The cops who did this were already finished. They just didn't know it yet. The prosecution wrapped up their scripted lies, and it was time for Detective Reed to take the stand. He walked up with an air of pure arrogance, adjusting his tie before settling into the witness chair. The lies started immediately. Miss Monroe was acting suspiciously the night of the arrest, Reed said smoothly, looking toward the jury with practiced ease. She was seen leaving a known drug house. When we approached, she became hostile and refused to cooperate. Hostile. Skylar's fingers curled into fists. What he meant was she had asked why she was being stopped. What he meant was she had dared to use her rights, and for that, she was labeled a threat. She resisted arrest, Reed continued, and attempted to flee. We later discovered the drugs in her vehicle, hidden under the passenger seat. Lies every word. Her lawyer tried to push back, but the judge shut him down with a warning glare. The case moved forward. piece by piece, the prosecution painting a picture of a dangerous girl who deserved to be locked away. The jury ate it up. The judge barely listened. The weight of the moment pressed against Skylar Monroe's chest, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't a trial, it was an execution. A performance where the actors had already rehearsed their lines. The script was already written, and the ending was decided before she even walked into the room. The walls of the courtroom felt smaller, closing in around her. The polished wooden floors, the stiff chairs, the cold gaze of the judge, all of it blurred into the background as she sat there, hands clasped together, trying to hold on to the last bit of hope she had left. Hope, what a pathetic thing to have in a place like this, because she could already see the way this was going to play out. The jury sat there, stiff and indifferent, barely looking at her. The prosecutor stood tall, confident, as if he knew this was a game he couldn't lose. And then there were the cops. Detectives Reed and Sullivan, sitting at the prosecution's table like they had just won a championship. Their smirks were subtle, but undeniable, their arrogance seeping into every movement. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The prosecution may continue. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue suit stepped forward. The prosecutor, the man who had spent the last 6 months building a case out of lies, he turned to face the jury, his expression carefully crafted, balancing between authority and false sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady and measured. "What we have here is a case of a young woman making a series of very poor choices, a case of law enforcement doing their job, protecting our communities from dangerous criminals." Skylar clenched her fists. "We have evidence. We have witnesses. We have everything we need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Miss Monroe was caught in possession of illegal substances with intent to distribute." And there it was. The lie wrapped in a perfectly rehearsed speech. The prosecutor gestured toward the black duffel bag sitting on the evidence table, the bag they claimed she had been carrying, the bag that had been planted before she even stepped foot in that gas station. He moved to the screen at the front of the courtroom, pressing a button on the remote in his hand. The grainy video played footage of a dark parking lot, a silhouette of a woman standing near a car, her face unclear, handing something off to another figure. Jury leaned forward. The prosecutor turned back to them, shaking his head. "This is a classic case of a criminal who doesn't want to face the consequences of her actions. She was seen, she was caught, and now she wants to convince you that she's innocent." Skylar's chest tightened. That wasn't her. That wasn't her in the video, but that wouldn't matter, would it? The jury already believed it was. The judge didn't care. Her lawyer wasn't even trying to fight back. "Call your first witness, counselor," the judge said, bored. And then Detective Sullivan took the stand. Detective Sullivan walked up with the ease of a man who had done this before. He sat down with confidence, adjusted his tie, and leaned forward, ready to play his part in this performance. "Detective Sullivan, can you walk us through what happened the night of the arrest?" Sullivan cleared his throat, then put on his best "I am just here to protect the community" face, of course. "We had been monitoring suspicious activity in the area for weeks. We knew there was drug trafficking happening in that location. When we spotted Miss Monroe making an exchange in the back lot, we knew we had to step in. And when you approached her, what happened?" the prosecutor asked. "She resisted arrest, Your Honor." A beat of silence. Skylar felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach, lies every single word out of his mouth. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "So, you are saying that Miss Monroe was not only in possession of drugs, but she also became aggressive when confronted by law enforcement?" Sullivan sighed dramatically. "Unfortunately, yes. We tried to handle it professionally, but she was uncooperative. We had no choice but to detain her." Skylar couldn't breathe. "Thank you, Detective Sullivan. No further questions." Lawyer stood up, weak, hesitant. "Detective Sullivan, there is no body cam footage of the arrest, correct?" "That's correct." "And no DNA evidence linking Miss Monroe to the drugs in the duffel bag?" Sullivan paused, then smirked. "No, but we have our eyewitness testimony, and in my experience criminals don't always leave a trail." A few chuckles rippled through the jury. Skylar's hands shook with rage. The judge sighed loudly. "Move it along, counselor." And just like that, her lawyer gave up. "No further questions, Your Honor." It was over. It had been over before it even started. The trial was rigged, that cops were winning. But the moment David Monroe stepped in, the entire courtroom was about to turn upside down. The jury filed out. Minutes later they returned. The judge cleared his throat, fixing Skylar with a look of finality. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman stood, expressionless. "We have, Your Honor." "And what is your verdict?" A pause, then "guilty." The courtroom erupted. Her mother collapsed, sobbing. The cops shook hands, congratulating each other. Skylar's vision blurred. 20 years for a crime she did not commit. The judge's gavel slammed against the word "sentencing." "Will proceed immediately." She felt like she was sinking, drowning. The reality of 20 years in prison loomed over her like a weight. She could not escape. The prosecution's victory seemed inevitable. They thought they had won. They thought they had destroyed her, had her neatly boxed in, but they had no idea what was about to happen. As Skylar sat there, trying to breathe through the panic, she couldn't help but notice the satisfied smiles on the faces of Detectives Reed and Sullivan, the two men who had set everything in motion. Their eyes flickered with triumph. They exchanged a quiet, smug glance as if savoring their victory. Reed adjusted his collar with casual arrogance. Sullivan smirked, as if to say, "We did it again. Another life ruined. Another win for us." Their arrogance was palpable, their confidence unshaken. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that everything was about to change. The courtroom had been a stage. Skylar Monroe had been the sacrificial lamb. The system had played its role flawlessly. The fake evidence, the false witnesses, the corrupt cops and judge, all moving in perfect unison to destroy an innocent girl's life. But the moment her father walked into that courtroom, the countdown to their downfall began. The air shifted as the doors opened with a sudden creak. David Monroe entered the room. His presence was quiet, yet commanding, slicing through the tension like a blade. His appearance was calm, collected, unshaken by the chaos around him. His black suit was perfectly tailored, his posture that of someone who had seen far worse than this. His expression was stoic, but those who knew him understood he wasn't here for the show. He was here for a purpose that would shatter the very foundation of the courtroom's rigged system. Skylar glanced toward the back of the room, her heart leaping as she saw him. Her father, David Monroe, the most dangerous man in the room. Yet his demeanor was calm as ever. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom and handed a classified folder to the judge. The judge looked at the folder, then at David, his confusion clear. "What is this?" he asked. Though the hesitation in his voice betrayed unease, David didn't flinch. He didn't speak for a moment, letting the silence linger and grow heavier. Then his voice came soft but unmistakable. "Your Honor, before you pass final sentencing, I suggest you read what's inside." The judge hesitated. His fingers twitched at the edges of the folder. His eyes narrowed, but he gave in, flicking it open. The moment his eyes hit the first document, his face went pale. The courtroom went still. The truth had arrived. The courtroom was silent. The collective breath of everyone caught in their throats. The truth had arrived and there was no turning back. The judge barely managed to compose himself, but his pale face betrayed what he had seen. This was no ordinary piece of evidence. The room had shifted in an instant. Every eye was on the folder, on the judge, on David Monroe. The prosecutor, who had been basking in the glow of victory minutes earlier, now looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His expression flickered between confusion and panic. David's calm was like a storm waiting to break. Tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The defense attorney, now armed with the most dangerous of weapons, stepped forward and pressed the button on the monitor. The real footage began to play. The first image was grainy, an unmarked police car pulling into a dark parking lot. Skylar's car was parked there, but she wasn't doing anything suspicious. The video was unedited, untouched, a real-time capture of the events as they actually unfolded. Skylar was simply entering the convenience store. There was no drug deal, no exchange, just a girl buying a snack. The camera angle shifted. No mystery, no crime, nothing but Skylar. The room was dead silent. The prosecutor's jaw clenched as his lies unraveled in front of him. But it wasn't over. The second clip started playing. This time, body cam footage. The familiar crackling of police radios filled the room. The camera showed Detective Reed walking behind the police vehicle, holding a black duffel bag in his hands. He moved toward Skylar's car and, with deliberate motions, slipped the bag under her seat. The footage didn't lie. It was as clear as day. The drugs they had accused her of possessing planted the entire case built on lies. And now the truth was playing out for everyone to see. The prosecutor's face turned red. Detective Reed's smirk vanished. Sullivan reached for his collar, sweat beading on his forehead. "This isn't possible," the prosecutor stammered. "They erased this footage. They covered their tracks, but no one was listening to him anymore." The jury leaned forward, whispering among themselves, struggling to process what they were seeing. The room vibrated with disbelief and outrage. And then, the real bombshell dropped. Audio footage. Reed's voice, casual, smug, cruel. "We could throw a brick of coke at any black kid in this city, and a jury will still take our word over theirs. It's that easy." The courtroom erupted. There was no more hiding. The smug smiles on Reed and Sullivan's faces dissolved into panic as their dirty deeds were exposed. The prosecutor, once so confident, wiped sweat from his forehead, unable to look anyone in the eye. The judge, who had dismissed every objection, suddenly found himself surrounded by the very law he had ignored for years. And then came the final blow. David Monroe stood, every eye locked on him. His voice was steady, unwavering. "You thought my daughter was just another statistic. You thought no one would come for her. But you made a mistake. You framed the wrong girl." The words cut through the chaos like a blade. Reed and Sullivan exchanged a quick, nervous glance. For the first time, they looked unsure. The tension was electric. The walls of the courtroom felt like they might explode from the weight of what had just been revealed. The judge sat in stunned silence. Skylar Monroe was freed, the cuffs unlocked from her wrists. Her hands trembled as she stood, her eyes locking on her father. David Monroe didn't flinch. He simply gave a single nod as though this moment had been years in the making, and then the doors swung open and marched the Department of Justice, followed by FBI agents, followed by Internal Affairs, warrants in hand. Federal agents moved fast, heading straight for Detectives Reed and Sullivan. The two men who had been so confident, who had smirked and laughed in this very courtroom, they weren't laughing anymore. Their hands were yanked behind their backs. Cuffs snapped into place, the same way they had cuffed innocent people for years. The judge tried to stand, but a DOJ agent stepped forward and placed a file on his desk. A second investigation. Into him, the judge fell back into his chair, his world crumbling. The FBI and DOJ agents had been waiting. Their presence was undeniable as they stormed into the courtroom, eyes locked on the guilty parties. They moved with swift efficiency, handcuffing Reed and Sullivan, the defense attorney. With newfound strength, called for an immediate reversal of Schuyler's conviction. And in mere moments, the case was overturned. The air shifted again. Authority was no longer in the hands of the corrupt, it was in the hands of federal law. Detectives Reed and Sullivan, once smug and untouchable, now stood in shock, their arrogant expressions replaced with fear, their confidence shattered. "You're under arrest for perjury, corruption, and evidence tampering." An FBI agent's voice rang out, steady, unshakable. The words echoed across the courtroom, drowning out the gasps of the spectators. Reed and Sullivan were dragged out, their smug grins gone, replaced by panic. They could do nothing but watch as their empire of lies collapsed around them. Schuyler, wiping her tears, whispered, "They finally got what they deserved." But it wasn't just Reed and Sullivan. The corruption ran deep. The district attorney, once so confident, was now under investigation for pushing false convictions. The judge, who had facilitated this miscarriage of justice, was forced to resign in disgrace. The courtroom was no longer theirs. Schuyler sat there, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of everything she had endured. The years of pain, the injustice hanging in the air. She wasn't sure she could breathe. But as she turned her eyes back to her father, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her freedom. This was about the beginning of something much bigger. The judge, once so eager to sentence her, now had no choice. With undeniable evidence laid before him, he overturned the conviction. Schuyler Monroe, the innocent black girl framed by the system, was finally free. Her mother collapsed into her arms, sobbing with relief. For the first time in so long, Schuyler did not feel like a criminal. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. The courtroom erupted into cheers. But Schuyler's focus was on her father. David Monroe stood calm and steady. He reached for her hand. He didn't say anything. There was no need. The weight of his silence carried more meaning than words ever could. He had saved her. As the gavel came down to formally close the case, Schuyler's world seemed to shatter and rebuild, all at once. She was free, but this was bigger than her. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Schuyler and David walked out together, past the prosecutor who looked like he was about to vomit, past the detectives being dragged away in cuffs, past the judge whose career had just ended. Outside, the fresh air hit her face. For the first time, she was no longer chained by injustice. But David Monroe wasn't finished. He had already made calls, pulled strings, and leveraged his influence. It wasn't just about punishing two officers. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt network that allowed them to operate. The FBI began digging into the department's dirty files, uncovering a pattern of corruption that stretched far beyond Reed and Sullivan. The Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation into the entire precinct. Fake reports, false arrests, fabricated evidence, all of it came to light. Internal Affairs, now under intense scrutiny, began investigating its own. The system was beginning to collapse, piece by piece, and even as the old order crumbled, Schuyler knew her own journey was far from over. She had scars, physical and emotional, that would last long after the headlines faded, but she was a fighter. She wasn't going to let her pain define her. She started working with activist groups, speaking out against corruption, becoming a voice for victims who had been silenced. Her story spread. Apologies began to arrive. From neighbors who once doubted her, from community leaders who had looked the other way, even from members of the jury who had been manipulated by false evidence. But the most meaningful apology came from her mother, not spoken in words, but shown through relief, pride, and the recognition that her daughter was no longer just a victim but a warrior. Schuyler's story, combined with her father's relentless fight, sparked a nationwide movement. People took to the streets demanding accountability. Protests grew larger. The calls for reform grew louder. Her face became a symbol of resilience. She was no longer just a girl framed by the system. She was its reckoning. As Schuyler's activism grew, so did the investigations. No one who had played a role in her frame-up was safe anymore. The judge who had ignored the evidence, who had rubber-stamped every corrupt move, was not exempt. David Monroe made sure of it. He used every connection, every ounce of influence, to guarantee the judge faced accountability. The man who once wielded his gavel with arrogance now stood stripped of authority. He didn't just lose his seat, he faced public disgrace. and charges of misconduct were filed against him. The judge, once seen as an untouchable authority, became a cautionary tale, the man who failed to see justice when it was right in front of him. Skylar, meanwhile, stood tall at the front of rallies, her voice steady as she spoke about the road she had walked, from the nightmare of a false conviction to becoming a beacon of change. She turned her pain into power. At her side, her father remained, David Monroe, silent but ever present, his posture unwavering, his gaze protective. They had become a duo, a daughter who spoke for the voiceless and a father who dismantled the powerful. But now, it wasn't about the past, it was about the future. Every speech Skylar gave pulled more people into the movement. Every interview, every protest, every story, the tide was turning. The echoes of the gavel that once condemned her now reverberated as a symbol of resistance. The corrupt courtroom that had tried to silence her was crumbling, but in its place rose something stronger. The system had tried to destroy her. Instead, it had created its greatest challenger. Skylar Monroe was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, a voice, a reckoning. The weeks after her release brought a new battle. Skylar was no longer fighting for her freedom. Now she was fighting for justice. She and her legal team filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. False arrest, false charges, fabricated evidence, years of pain and trauma. The city had wronged her, and now it would pay the price. David Monroe made sure this wasn't just another case buried in paperwork. He brought in one of the strongest legal teams in the country, not public defenders, not overworked associates, a team of experts who lived for trials like this. The defense tried to downplay it. They argued mistakes happen. They argued the officers had good intentions, but Skylar's lawyers dismantled them piece by piece. The evidence was irrefutable. The fake body cam footage, the planted drugs, the testimonies of officers who had buried the truth, and the most damning evidence of all, the recordings of Reed and Sullivan bragging about framing black suspects. The courtroom could not ignore it. The city could not bury it. The judge ruled in Skylar's favor. The city was ordered to pay her a settlement so large it shook the headlines. It's money that would secure her future, but more importantly, money that sent a message: corruption would not be tolerated. But David wasn't satisfied with just financial victory. This wasn't about money. This was about dismantling the system that had almost destroyed his daughter. Using his influence with the CIA, the FBI, and the Department of Justice, David began pushing for legislation, and it worked. The new law was groundbreaking. It declared that any officer who knowingly planted false evidence, fabricated testimony, or framed an innocent person would face criminal charges. No more slaps on the wrist, no more hiding behind badges. Accountability was now the law. Police departments across the country took notice. The reforms David pushed for became a blueprint for national change. Skylar's fight was no longer hers alone. Her name became tied to a movement that demanded honesty, accountability, and justice in law enforcement. Skylar Monroe's journey was no longer just her own. It had ignited a revolution. Across the country, police departments were forced to adapt to the new law. Officers who once hid behind silence were now accountable. The culture of immunity was crumbling. The message was clear: if you break the law, you will pay the price, no matter what badge you wear. For Skylar, the victory was more than legal, more than political. It was personal. She could finally stand in front of a mirror and see not a victim, but a survivor, a fighter, and a voice for countless others. Newspapers across the nation carried the headlines: corrupt cops brought to justice. Skylar Monroe wins landmark case. Her face appeared beside stories of reform, rallies, and a new era of accountability. David, as always, stayed in the background. He had pulled strings, dismantled networks, and forced hands, but the spotlight was on his daughter, where it belonged. Final piece of her journey came when she and her father stood in front of the new police station. The old regime was gone. In its place stood leadership committed to justice and integrity. The new chief, a man with a reputation for honesty, stepped forward to greet them. "Thank you for everything," he said, his handshake firm and genuine. Skylar smiled, a real smile, one that carried the weight of years of pain, but also the lightness of freedom. She looked at her father, and in that single glance was everything: gratitude, respect, and love. They had done it. Together they had taken down the corrupt system piece by piece. They had rebuilt something stronger, something that would protect the innocent instead of destroying them. As they turned and walked away, side by side, the sunlight filtered through the trees. The air was lighter, freer. Skylar knew one thing for certain: she was free. Injustice had been defeated, and justice, real justice, had finally been served.